three panelists here, and I would like to introduce Jayesh from Salesforce, Beer from Slack, and Dr. Phil Coyne with Voxbox. Yeah. So the first question is, what do you think? So I tried to start the discussion with the dimensionality. In my opinion, long tail and dimensionality of real experiences is a big problem. And companies that are trying to move fast and create something, and they expect that chatbots are less expensive than buttons. Because, well, you write the code and you have incoming text, you have output as a text, and it seems like you can create it like within 2 hours. The reality is that you have to invest in training, and this is much more than building buttons and code. What do you think? Is it the main problem, or probably you have other problems to discuss today? Yeah, please introduce yourself and.
You guys hear me okay?
No, turn it on. Yeah. Tip the button.
Can you hear me now? Sounds like a Verizon ad.
No button? Yeah.
There are conversational problems with physical and digital convergence.
Yep, we got no sound.
No sound.
There
Yeah.
Right. Cool. Now can you guys hear me?
Nope. That turns fine.
You should be able to hear me.
Hi there. Can you hear anything on this one? This one works?
All right. This is better? Cool.
Hello.
Okay.
Yeah.
Conversational problems. My name is Jayesh. I am... Okay.
You don't want to strangle?
No, it's just they're hearing feedback.
Yeah.
Swap them. Just talk over it.
All right, this is better? Thank you. All right, my name is Jayesh. I'm the VP of Data Science at Salesforce. My team works on a lot of interesting problems. Chatbots are one of them, question answering systems are another, all focused on how to make these systems work in the enterprise for enterprise companies.
Hi, my name is Bear. I lead the developer advocacy team at Slack. So it's our responsibility to work with startups and developers who are building on Slack's platform. So any chatbots that integrate with Slack, you might be working with somebody from my team.
Hi, I'm Phil Cohen. I'm the Chief Scientist for AI at VoiceBox. And we build voice interactive systems for automobiles and handsets and in the home, etc.
It's been a while since you've asked the question, so maybe I should repeat it.
Yeah. The question was, what are bottlenecks? Why chatbots did not change the world last year?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, our experience has been many reasons why that's the case. One is, of course, training data, and the second one that you call, the problem of the long tail. Lots of use cases, lots of very different vocabularies across domains. And in some ways, I think a lot of companies have overpromised and underdelivered on this. And we heard today from lots of other talks on what some of the challenges are for doing general purpose dialogue systems. And that's not a solved problem just yet. And in my view, a whole lot of companies that are approaching this are not taking the view that they should look at a certain industry and manually solve the dimensionality reduction problem by saying, I'm going to focus on industry A. And within that industry, I'm going to solve the top 5 problems that exist. For example, if you pick the IT industry, what do you think is the top incoming case request for agents? Any guesses? You got it, password reset. Have you seen a bot that just does password reset? Because I bet you if you did that, it'd be really good. It would just do that problem over and over again and do a great job. Why is that? Because you would constrain the vocabulary, you'd have data for solving that problem in many different ways. You'd have utterances, you'd have intents, you'd probably build the best intent classifier for password reset, and then build from there. So, I mean, short answer to your question is that, there are ways to constrain the problem, and I think we will see, with a little bit of backlash that we've seen last year, it's actually a good thing. I think we'll start to see companies taking a much more practical approach to solving this, using, excellent data science, good AI, but also being very practical about crafting the problem the right way.
Yeah, I think crafting the problem is, as you said, one of the biggest things that we need to do a little bit better. There's been a false trade-off between using buttons, using forms, using structured input, and having a purely conversational bot that I think we need to start doing a better job bridging the gap between. I think it's totally fine to have a mixture in your user experience of part of the experiences with buttons, with menus, where you're really directing the user in one way or another, and then the other can be free form. And I think you're going to see better end user experiences when you mix those as AI and as our means of creating data sets to train these AIs get better. We can fill in the gaps in the meantime with being opinionated about how we want users to solve their problems as well.
Very happy to hear you're advocating multimodal input, since that's a particularly interesting problem that some of us have worked on for a while. Just to throw down the gauntlet a little bit, perhaps it's the case that some of this technology is just inappropriately used. So really what we're building when you're building chatbots by giving conversations where you have a stimulus and a response is you're building an emulator of a conversation. You're building a simulator of a conversation. You're not actually having anybody engage in a conversation. So really what we're building are parrots. And I do mean a parrot in the bird sense. I once had a blue-fronted Amazon parrot, which is a 10 on the talking scale. And as my daughter did when she was 1 year old, when you turn out the light and you light a candle, the parrot sings happy birthday. Okay, so it's emulating what it's heard, but it has no notion of what a birthday is, whose birthday it is, what's a celebration, or what's going on here. So it has no semantics attached to what it's doing. Okay? It's just because it sees a stimulus and it gets a response. B.F. Skinner would be very happy. That's what we're building. Whereas it seems to me you ought to be building something with a back-end meaning representation. It's what people are calling semantic parsing. And then doing your deep learning relative to that, rather than relative to the actual response. Because you have no notion, or the system has no notion, it certainly can't explain what's going on in the middle. All it's doing is emulating it. If you think of the old saw of, given enough time, a troop of monkeys will type out Shakespeare. Well, that's what we would do if we gave these systems Shakespeare. It'll generate something that appears on the surface that looks like Shakespeare. But what would you rather read?
I would disagree. So I just
that's the whole point. I'm trying to get some disagreement up here.
Yeah, and it takes like time, which is not enough for the existence of the universe to write Shakespeare. It's not. It's a
well. It's producing things in the style of which it's been trained. Right?
Yeah, these are parrots.
They're parrots.
Parrots are good.
They're funny. They last for. I eventually got rid of my parrot because it emulated everything. It would emulate the phone conversations. It would emulate the coffee machine, etc. But what it's going to take to get something that's a bit more intelligent? Well, you may really want to have a meaning representation of some kind. And then the question is, now where are we going to get the data from that maps the utterances into those representations? And we do it the other way around. We map the representations into the utterances.
Yes and no. I think there is plenty of data to go around. The problem is that it's all mixed up, and there's no sort of clustering of the data by domain. So, for example, at Salesforce we have a ton of customers that we support that have a real password reset issue. Mm-hmm. They do actually send us chat transcripts, and they do get the problem solved. So there's a whole corpus of data at our disposal that we can use to teach a system to do one thing right.
Agreed.
The challenge is that it's mixed up with all the other stuff. So, and this is a real challenge, right? Is you need clean training data so that the parrot doesn't start talking nonsense stuff. On the flip side, what I see a lot of companies do is they say, look, I've got a ton of data, it's not clustered well, so I'm just going to try solving the harder problem, which is try to do everything.
Agree. And starting with the password reset, but there are all kinds of intents that you brought up. And if there's a way to build tools that make it possible to specify what your corporate intents are, which are the kind of functions that your corporate systems can actually execute, then you can work backwards from there to meaning representations that then can be used to generate utterances that can be used to train your systems. So it's a different methodology to building these systems for corporations.
Yeah, but you have this data, right? So you at Slack, you have the whole platform of conversations, and you get responses and questions. Are you able to extract something from that? Because Salesforce, they have sales part of conversations. You have data, and you see how other chatbots use this data. Can you be a source of this insightful data labeled and trained for chatbots?
So if I'm being quite honest, I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Are you saying
I say that
could we provide a training set?
Who owns the data? And
all right.
Salesforce owns that, kind of owns the data, which could be enough for training. You have your conversational platform. And,
Sorry, I should correct you. So Salesforce does not own the data. We are custodians of the data, and we take that very seriously. We would use it if our customers want us to use it, and we'd use it in a way that will benefit them.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, we're in the same boat. We wouldn't be using the conversations that were between bots and our users and then open sourcing that in any way without many, many layers of consent for all of that happening.
Why?
Why?
This is a
Because
problem. Yeah,
it's very
this is a
sensitive
problem.
information. It's people's business information that
We're
they're
discussing
exchanging.
problems, okay? That's why I'm asking these questions. They could be tough questions. I tried to find business conversations online, and I wasn't able to find anything. And there are Twitter discussions, chats, forums, and this information is available as training sets. But business information is confidential, and you have access to this information, but you legally cannot use that to train bots. And this is the problem. So you have this data, but you cannot use it for training.
Well, let me flip that back around on you. As a bot maker, would you want a system where you could opt in and say, all right, all conversations between my app and my users are public, and you have to disclose that to your users, so it may affect the way that they speak to your bot. Would you want to opt into that kind of system in order to, for the greater good, create this training set?
Greater good and your profit.
Is that a thing that you would want, and under what conditions? Right?
I want data. I want labeled data sets as a scientist. And this is the problem. Where we can find these data sets for business conversations? I have no answer. Probably you have some ideas.
I think this is a hard one. I think I'm going to take what you said and maybe add a few words to that as well. I think there's tremendous value, and this hasn't happened yet. You can imagine an industry-wide consortium for transportation industry, for the banking industry, for the tech industry, which sort of comes together and produces a data set that's a base data set. So it's sort of, there's a base layer of data that everyone agrees to share. It's anonymized. It's clean of PII information and all of that. And that benefits everyone in that consortium. And then on top of that, of course, you're going to have specific data sets that are company-specific, the vocabulary is company-specific, and that's where they compete.
Yeah.
This hasn't happened. We're in very early days right now. So this really hasn't happened yet. And if you sort of look back in the tech industry, it has happened in pockets where this has worked well. But it's when it comes to AI in general and how we deal with data, not just conversational systems, but in general, this hasn't happened. We haven't yet formed these consortiums. Wow. Okay. So we haven't. Yeah. This obviously is that had to be loud. So that's my point.
Yeah.
I think it's all very well to talk about how we could create this consortium of companies that have a vested interest in creating this data, but we can't leave out the end user and their feelings on it and whether or not PII is truly stripped. Like if you've copied someone's speech patterns, does that at one point when our models become very sophisticated become PII? How can you distinguish between the way people express themselves, and could you map that back to a person? Not today, probably not. But if we're trying to see far into the future, that does become a real concern that I think the users should have a voice in the way you do it. So for now, erring on the side of safety, I don't think that that's a thing that we would make available because we can't cut our end users out of that conversation in that way.
Well, I think perhaps, yeah, that one.
Yes, you may.
I think perhaps the quest is backwards. That is, we should be trying to build systems with the least amount of data, not with the most amount of data. The reason why we don't build systems now with complex grammars of natural language is because they don't scale to multiple languages reasonably well in those grammars and ill-formed human language. But many of those systems, including the standard unification parsers and some of the other lighter weight dependency parsers, they're really, really good. And they can produce, independent of training data, they're built to get the bulk of linguistic constructions. So, of course, they have their limitations. But we ought to be trying, it seems to me, to figure out how can we do something so that it cuts across domain, from one domain to the other with minimal extensions versus I can't do anything unless I have a massive corpus. You want transfer learning, as you talked about. You want systems to be able to produce compositional semantic meanings so that the meaning of the whole is a function of the meaning of the parts. You want systems that actually can do similar kinds of reasoning and compositional reasoning for intention. Let me give you a simple example. So most people, you build a system, if you're given an informative utterance, most of these systems you can't tell anything to. I don't mean a chatbot system, I mean some of these other natural language systems that are trained. You can't tell it anything. You have to actually learn it. It's not learning by being told, it's learning by a corpus. But if I tell you, you're standing on my foot, is an appropriate answer to say, yes, I am. Okay, so even though it's an informative sentence, it's actually a request. And there's lots of examples like that. Figuring out and how to respond to somebody's intentions versus exactly what they said. Ashwin talked about that earlier today, is the hallmark of dialogue. And you need systems to know how to make that inference as opposed to, and maybe you train them to make that inference, but we have to avoid just the literality of the current, you say this, I'd say that in response.
Yeah, just another question. Yeah, you say that you can extract semantic layers, meaning, and could you tell a bit more about that? How, without that business data, you can...
I didn't say without the business data. I said start with the business data. Start with the APIs. Produce the meaning representations derived from that. And then we can train to map into that.
What sources of data do you use?
Oh, schemas of databases, other kinds of actions that databases, your back-end systems can perform. They're using data types. Maybe you put it into a knowledge representation, so you're representing it at a higher level than the actual data source itself. And then you can, the systems can produce the compositional functionality and independent of the initial intents. We used to call them propositional contents from an existing utterance, but now I can do conjunction, I can do superlatives, I can do comparatives, I can do a whole variety of other things, knowing what the basic functions and their types are. So I can build systems like that and then map the utterances onto them, and they're much more capable than the kind of stuff you're seeing from Siri today.
I beg to differ on this one. I think if you saw the talks today, if you want to use some of the modern methods, you are going to have to assume that they're data hogs. All the neural network methods that were introduced today require tons of data. The methods that you're talking about are, of course, they work extremely well, but that graph that was shown today where you have handcrafted machine learning methods, which I don't sneeze on at all, I think those are important. At some point, we have to have the next level, and for that, I think it's absolutely important to have these conversations on how are we going to agree on using a data set that works for everybody with opt-in from the end user.
I think you misunderstand me. I'm saying that if you give me your data from your corporate.
This is the problem.
No, I don't want the data. I want, you're a corporation, you hand me the schema of your databases, and I build a system that crawls your databases because you're paying me for this. I crawl your, the actions that your system can perform, those 1,000 intents. I'm building systems that do that automatically. Then they're automatically generating the language of the meaning representations. And then we're going out and getting methodologies that will map utterances, and this is where the big data comes in, but I don't have to go out and get a corpus initially. I'm working backwards so that now I have the meaning representations and I have a huge collection of utterances that maps into those meaning representations.
How we can reuse this corpus, this data? Many companies are trying to create their chatbots, but they have no data, and they trying to build these rules, and after all, I
just gave you a methodology for doing it with no data as it is now. You just give me the back end.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, when you create your database schema, you're making a set of assumptions about what sort of inputs you're going to be receiving. So in the same way, you're not really starting backwards. You're sort of starting from the middle, where you had a set of human assumptions that then in turn structure what you can do with the data that you feed in to create those systems, right? Because some human created that schema that's structuring how you're approaching your whole data set. So you are starting with some sort of understanding of what you assume the problem space is. And what you might want to do after that is create a way that you can adapt if what people are coming at you with doesn't match your existing assumptions. But yeah, you start off with a schema. That's, I think, what everyone does. And yeah, it's going to involve some key assumptions on your part. If you want to pound the pavement, you can do some user research first. But for the most part, I think people are generally on target about their business needs when they create these, but I shouldn't speak for everyone.
No, yeah, I think oftentimes it's up to the customer. So imagine you build tools for doing a chatbot. What's the very first page that you see when you're building a chatbot? There is a page where you type in your utterances, and there's a label that you assign to it. Is it painful? Absolutely is. Is it the kind of data that at scale you would want to use across all your customers? Yes, but no, I think we should recognize that customers are going to be a bit antsy about sharing that across to their competitors as well. So I think there isn't an elegant answer, that is my sort of take on it. And the closest I can come to it is this sort of industry-wide data set that, at some point I'm willing to bet somebody's going to produce and that company is going to win the game.
Can you give advice to those who build bots now? Okay, I'm a coffee shop and I want to have a great chatbot. I want to put like 7 intents to the system, like API AI, they have these tools.
Yep.
And I want to understand the rest automatically. I want to have my business intents, and I want any platform, your platform or Watson's platform, to be able to understand other topics, other conversations, and be able to, like, probably in stimulus reaction style, respond
I don't want
to questions.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to do that.
I'm asking, what could you recommend to those who build bots? Other technologies like that? Probably you say about this libraries or domain-specific consortium databases that bot builders can use and take care of business intents and have conversational parts derived from your data or
Without having a corpus of data.
yeah, probably you have a solution for that. I think that's
Yeah, I do. But
Yeah, it is.
that's the methodology I gave you is one that could be extended to doing that. You start with your 5, 10, 15, 20 intents,
Yeah.
and then you compositionally sample the set of possible meaning representations that would map into those intents, and then you generate or get a range of utterances by a variety of methods that would map into those meaning representations. And of course, you need a system that also knows how to engage in dialogue. It's not merely getting the literal utterance, it's how do you actually conduct a dialogue. And it's actually a different story than the one you talked about. By the way, I am advocating that people should use shared tasks, as the academic community does, all the time. You can, there are a few papers here, Maluba was giving examples, and there are other shared tasks. There are shared tasks on semantic parsing from University of Heidelberg. There are a variety of shared tasks that can be used. Whether you're going to get a consortium of companies to do that, that's a good goal. I don't know if you can.
Bear, could you tell us about successful chatbots that you have in the platform?
Sure. So one of the best conversational bots that I've seen is called StatsBot. It is a conversational UI on your statistics across Google Analytics, Mixpanel, and a bunch of other integrations that they have. And you can say things like, show me my website traffic to this domain for thus and such period of time. And StatsBot interprets that and gives you back a graph or answers to your questions. And they're one of the few that do it truly conversationally and not with a lot of buttons in the middle, and they do a beautiful job of interpreting intents. I think they do benefit from that. People who are coming to them with requests tend to be very specific by the nature of what they're trying to do. You want to know a specific growth rate, or you have keywords that can help you make your request a lot more parsable. We've seen a lot of successful bots that don't use AI at all, like a bot called Polly that does polls inside Slack. And they are a bot in that you interact with in a conversational way in some cases, but at the end of the day, a lot of their inputs are structured through buttons and through message and menu inputs. So does it have to be a requirement to be successful? I don't think so, but different companies have taken different strategic approaches to good effect.
Do you have any examples of your chatbots at Salesforce that you can share?
No specific examples, but I completely agree with you. I think my view is that if you're able to constrain the problem, you constrain the vocabulary as a result. And when you constrain the vocabulary, it's that much more easier to build something that is easily understood. The one sort of learning we had is sort of bots fall under two buckets. One is a task-oriented bot, and the other is more of an informational bot. As counterintuitive as it is, I think the task bots are likely to succeed more than the informational ones, because there's so many ways to ask the same question. Whereas if you want something done, there is enough of a carrot at the end of it that you will find a good way to phrase your thing that needs to be done. Again, I don't have a whole lot of data on this, and I'm still forming my opinions, but my view is that if you think of your bots as being task-oriented versus informational, that's maybe one good way to break it down. And start with task-oriented bots, be specific, focus on one industry, get your vocabulary down, go deep, get some success before going wide.
And sure, there are examples of the kind of, I don't call them bots, but systems of the kind that I discussed on our VoiceBox YouTube channel. There are a bunch of videos that'll give you some examples. But we do it in the domain of location intelligence because we're working with automotive companies. So Things like, where's the closest parking to the Japanese restaurant that's nearest to the Space Needle? Things like that, which are more complex and have more embeddings than standard kinds of utterances that you might run across. But also it handles pronouns and a variety of other dialogue structures that are seemingly problematic for a lot of the agents that you see out there now.
Yeah, we are probably have one more question to finish. Could you give advice to those who build bots now? What they should do, what they should not, and what is your experience? For example, Slackbot. Let's start with Slackbot. What
Sure.
is the best next idea for Slackbot, and how to do that with your
So again, quickly to clarify, do you mean Slackbot, the bot that is built into Slack as part of the product, or do you mean a Slackbot? Either, both. Okay.
Give you advice.
So we do have some guidelines internally when we're thinking about things that Slackbot should and should not do. Essentially, we shouldn't be using it to question users about anything in the experience. We should be using it minimally for teaching people to do things, and also listening for when they need help. And in a similar way, I think one of the things that I would give just as general advice to people who are building conversational bots now is to focus on your end user experience. It's not for anything if you build a sophisticated system that is working very hard to interpret people's intents, to understand their true meaning, if at the end of the day it's failing to help them do the thing that they want to do. So help them stick around by giving them the result that they want, and then from there you can incrementally start to make it smarter, make it better. But the first thing first is figure out what your users are trying to do, help them do it, and then take it from there. It seems like very simple, silly advice, but you might be surprised how many people are focused on how cool their tech is, which is not to say that it's not cool. It's probably really cool, but if it's not really helping people, it's not doing its job yet.
I couldn't agree more. Although I haven't been too agreeable. But the idea of take a look at your end user experience and use multimodal where you can, use natural language where it makes sense. But when you are using a multimodal situation, make sure that anything you put on the screen is something that your system can expect in response. So words that appear on the screen are things the user is likely to use in response. Both in a GUI type application, but also linguistically. It's well known that people imitate their interlocutors. If it's a verbal interaction, if you speed up, they'll speed up. If you use wild pitch contours, they'll use wild pitch contours, for better or worse. So this kind of imitation can be used to your advantage to make sure that the kind of utterances you produce, talking about natural language generation, are the kind of utterances you can analyze. Because they'll imitate it.
Yeah, this is a very agreeable panel. I couldn't agree more. So, in terms of advice, I'll give you what not to do, which is very similar to what you guys are talking about, and a few things that you can possibly do to get things to work well. What you shouldn't do is look at the best sequence-to-sequence model out there and say, how can I use this sequence-to-sequence model to build a completely automated chatbot? Wrong approach. Please don't do that. What you should do is look at the data that you do have, which could be prior data in form of chat transcripts that you get from your customers. That's a really good starting point. And stare at it long enough to figure out how can you build a very simple intent classifier. Naive Bayes works just as well. Step one is really important. Second thing is think a little bit about personalization. One of the big things that e-commerce companies do extremely well is cheat. They cheat by building a deep user interest graph for every user and just show you what works for other users that are like you. In the case of customer service, if you know that someone is a person that's bought a $10 product versus someone else that's bought a $5,000 product, please don't try to use the $5,000 guy with a bot. Send him to the actual agent. But for the $10 use case, go off and be as experimental as you can. So routing is as important. When not to engage a bot is as important. Possibly the third bit of advice I'd share is build a evaluate, test, iterate loop quickly. Get it in the hands of your users, even if it's for some really simple use case. Try to iterate really fast and start with the simplest models. They're almost always easy to debug, and then get sophisticated over time. And maybe the last one is use humans in the loop. I think we talked about this before. I cannot stress this long enough. There's two sets of humans in the loop that you should use. One is the end user. Use techniques like what Google does with did you mean. If you're not sure what the intent is, ask the user, did you actually mean A, B, or C? And that gives you a lot of reinforcement learning for free. The second set, you may or may not have access to this, we do, and we're lucky for that, is on the agent side. So you have a bot that's between an end user and an agent. Sometimes it gets it wrong. The probability scores are off. We actually ask the agent if this is what it should be corrected to. And that's a reinforcement learning loop number 2. So if you have access to use those, build that whole end-to-end system with a very simple model in the middle, and then iterate quickly over time.
Actually, I had one last thing. Jumping off what you said about people will reflect your voice back to you in your tone. Hire a real writer to write your bot conversation content, because if you just write the thing that comes to your mind first, you may not be writing for clarity in a way that somebody who's trained to can make content that internationalizes well, that comes outside English jargon, American jargon. And when you speak clearly to a person, you'll get back something that's clearer in response. And like you said, it'll be easier to interpret. So don't underestimate the value of getting somebody who knows what they're doing to write your bot content.
But as an AI researcher, I don't want to write bot content. I want it to write it itself. But we're not there yet. And the other thing to watch out for, of course, if you have humans in the loop where they think they're training the bot that's going to replace them, you're not going to end up with a good result.
Guys,
Thank you.
thanks so much. Artemy, Jayesh, Bear, and Dr. Phil. Big round of applause for these guys. Awesome job.